Hi there. Well, we're going to start chapter 2 now, and it deals with positives and negatives and multiplying and dividing, adding and subtracting, but it also talks about comparing. So here's an example when you're comparing positives and negative numbers. Here, I'm trying to get this so I can see or something. All right, there. Okay, I think that'll work. All right, let's say I wanted to compare A and E. And when they ask you to compare, it's going to be with a less than or with a greater than symbol is what we'll be comparing them to. Now, when a number is less than a number, it's because it's to the left on a number line. So anything like if you were to look at the E, anything to the left of 0, anything over here would be considered less than 0. Anything to the right of the 0 would be considered greater than 0. So let's compare two of these. Let's compare A and E. So A, which is about -5, -6, -7, -8. So how does -8 compare to E, which is 0? Well, -8 is to the left on the number line. So A is less than E because it's to the left on the number line. Always have the pointing in towards the smaller number. This is red. A is less than E. Okay, let's look at E. E and F. E here, and here's F. E is to the left of the F, which is 8 as well, +8. So E is less than F because E is to the left of the F. So E is less than. Obviously, we know that 0 is less than 8. K, let's compare K with A. K is a -4 and A is a -8. -4 is larger than a -8 because this is to the right. K is to the right of the A. So K is greater than A. So a -4 is larger than a -8. Let's compare B and A. B is here. B is roughly a +4 and A is a -8. I know that A is less than the B, or you can think of it as B is larger than the A. Anything to the right of a certain number will be larger. So B is larger than the A because it's to the right of the A. Let's compare K with F. K is to the left of the F. So K is a -4 and F is a +8. So this K will be less than the F. That's how you compare those numbers. Let's look at a couple more examples before we talk about some absolute values. Here, let's do some examples. The same idea now. Think of a number line. A -1 is to the left of the 0, so it's less than. All right. Here, 4 is to the right of a -4 on a number line. So 4 is greater than a -4 because 4 is to the right on a number line. -42 is further to the left than a -21. Anything to the left of another number is always less than. So -42 is less than a -21 because this number is to the left on a number line, so it's less. Here, 1 is to the right of a -15. This is a positive number. All positive numbers are going to be to the right of any negative number. So this 1 is greater than, oops, this is greater than a -15. Okay, here negative 24 compared to a negative 18. A negative 24 is to the left of a negative 18, so it's less than. Okay, last one. Negative 8 is to the right of a negative 9 on the number line. So you go negative 8, negative 9, negative 10. Because it's to the right, it's larger on the number. Since negative 8 is to the right on a number line, it's larger. So negative 8 is greater than a negative 9. Okay. All right, so the next thing in this section deals with absolute values and opposites. And absolute values and opposites are not the same thing. I have a piece of lead there. So we'll talk about the difference between them, and then we'll do some sample problems. The symbols that we have for absolute values are two straight lines, and then we put a number in between. Now, absolute values are used for distances, you know, whether it's 5 miles, 5 meters, whichever. Distances are always positive. So the absolute value, this is red, the absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of a negative 5 is 5. All right, so absolute values, in order to get rid of these, it's going to be positive. And then once you've made it positive, you can drop the absolute value signs. So let's say the absolute value of 2 is 2. The absolute value of a negative 100 is 100. They're always positive when you want to drop the absolute values, it's a positive. Drop the absolute values, it's a positive. So no matter what, they're always positive. The absolute value of 0 is 0. All right, so that's absolute value. Now, how does that compare to opposite? Well, if I want the opposite of a number rather than the absolute value, there's two ways you can they can say find the opposite of a number, and then they can list the numbers. Another way of writing find the opposite using algebra is that right there. That negative is a little large, kind of looks like a subtraction sign. Doesn't have to be that large, but whenever you have a negative outside of a variable, it means find the opposite of that variable. These two statements mean the exact same thing. Find the opposite, find the opposite. So this one would say find the opposite of like a negative 5. The opposite of a negative 5 is 5. Or the opposite of 10 is a negative 10. So I'm finding the opposite. They're actually just giving you the number and asking for the opposite. The opposite of a negative 1 is a positive 1. The opposite of 8 is a negative 8. Okay, so they're going to give you the number and ask you for the opposite. This, however, even though it means the same thing, it's going to be, it will look a little different. They'll give you this, and then they'll say, find this right here, but they'll say x is 2. Well, the opposite of x is a negative 2. So they're going to actually say x is 2. And they want the opposite of 2 is a negative 2. Or maybe x is a negative 5. So the opposite of our x is a negative 5, is a positive 5. Let's say x is 1. The opposite of x is a negative 1. Let's say x is a negative 20. The opposite of x is a positive 20. So again, it's a way of finding the opposite. It's just stated differently, but it really means the same thing. Then they're going to ask you, they're going to put the two together. All right, so here, they're going to say, find the opposite of the absolute value, and they may even put negatives in there. All right. Well, knowing that the absolute value is always positive, it doesn't matter how many negatives I have inside. Because if they give you an X, let's say X is 3. If I put 3 in, this right here will be a positive 3 no matter what. Absolute values are always positive. But this out here means take the opposite of that. Well, the opposite of a positive number, this will always be positive. The opposite of a positive number is a negative number. So no matter what we put in, it will into here. This part will be positive always, and we'll be taking the opposite of a positive number is always negative. Let's do some examples here because I guess it's kind of confusing. So let's put in a -5 in for X. All right. So here, if I put in a -5 here, it doesn't really matter about this. It doesn't matter about this. This part will always be positive. And once I make it positive, I can drop the absolute values and use a parentheses if I want to. So no matter what I'm putting in, it doesn't matter how many negatives I've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, it doesn't matter. Here, because of these absolute values, it'll be positive. But this guy out here says take the opposite of that. So you get a -5. So the opposite of a positive is a -5. Okay, let's try another one of those for this section here. So let's go at opposite of a -x. And I'm sure that's what they wanted was the opposite of a negative. Yeah. But let's say that x is 10. All right. What would this be equal to? Well, I know that when I put 10 in, even though I have this negative, it doesn't matter because absolute values are always positive. So this section right here will be a positive 10. Okay. And I have this outside means take the opposite after you've done the absolute value. So I'm going to replace the opposites with a parentheses. Excuse me, I'm going to replace the absolute values with a parentheses, and then I'm going to take the opposite of that. So actually, no matter what you put in, you're taking the opposite of a positive number. All of your answers here will always be negative because you're always taking the opposite of a positive. So even if I put in a -200, they want the opposite of that positive there, value. So the opposite of a positive 200 is a -200. I'm always taking the opposite of a positive. It'll always be a negative. So you're just kind of going back and forth with each other is what you're doing here. All right. So again, I know here, let's just try one more. Let's say that x is 5. What is the opposite? And they just throw this negative in, okay, even though it has really no relevance because we're going to be taking the absolute value, no matter how many negatives you have in here. So if I were to put 5 in, I'm going to get +5 every time. And the opposite of 5 is a -5. Okay. One of the more confusing things in that section. So again, you need to be able to find the absolute value. Absolute values are always positive. Opposites, these two mean the same thing. They'll say, find the opposite of a -5, which is 5, or find the opposite of 10, which is a -10. So don't get the absolute value mixed up with opposite. Absolute values are always positive, but the opposites change signs. The opposite of 10 is a -10. The opposite of a -1 is a +1. This is another way of saying opposite. So they want the opposite of the x. Well, if x is 2, the opposite is a -2. If x is a -5, the opposite, that's what that means, is a +5. So this negative outside of an x means take the opposite. So if x is 1, the opposite of 1 is a -1. If x is a -20, the opposite of a -20 is a +20. All righty. And then they put the two ideas together with absolute value and the opposite. And so we found out that absolute values are positive. So the opposite of a positive is always negative. This will always be a negative. All right. That pretty much covers section 2.1. What we're now going to look at is 2.2. In 2.2, we're going to be adding positives and negatives together and negatives and negatives together. And you can use a number line, but I think the number line can get a little confusing, especially when we start subtraction. What I think is a little bit easier, for instance, if in order to use a method that I like, you need to realize that if you have a -1 and you add a +1 to it, you always end up with 0. So a -1 and a +1 is 0. That's what this whole idea that I'm going to be showing you hinges on. If I have 2 and I add a -2, I get 0. Or if I have a -10 plus 10, I get 0. When you add, so if you have, I guess if you dug a hole and then you fill it in, you're back to where you started at 0. So knowing this idea, understanding this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 plus a -1. Now, this means I have 3 positives. So I'll do these 3 positives. I'll just circle them like 3 positive discs. And I have a -1 disc. So I have 3 positives and 1 negative. The thing to remember is that these add up to 0. These cancel each other out. And so you're left with 2 positives. And there's your answer. So this negative is going to cancel one of those and leave you with 2 positives. All right, let's say I have a -5 plus 7. This means I have 3 negatives, or excuse me, I have 5 negatives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives, and I have 7 positives. 5 of these are going to cancel with 5 of those. So 5 of these negatives cancel with 5 of those positives. It's going to leave you with 2 positives. So your answer is a +2. All right, let's look at another one. Let's say I have a -4 plus 2. So I have 4 negatives, 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives, and I have 2 positives. Okay, these cancel out, this negative. So 2 of the positives are going to take care of 2 of those negatives, but I still have 2 negatives left. So your answer is a -2. 2 of those canceled with 2 of those, but you still have 2 of the negatives. Let's keep working on this idea. Let's go with -6 plus, let's say 3. So I have 6 negatives, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 3 positives. 3 of these positives are going to cancel out 3 of the negatives. These all add up to 0. And you're left with 3 negatives. Your answer is a -3. So I have, what we're going to do is I have a worksheet here, and we're going to look at some of the examples using this idea. Okay. All right. So we have 8 negatives and 5 positives. So I know that 5 of these positives are going to cancel 5 of those negatives, but I'll end up with 3 negatives left over when that happens. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 negatives and 5 positives. Those add up to 0. Okay, so they're gone. They cancel each other out. 5 of these positives cancel 5 of the negatives, but you still have 3 negatives left. Your answer is a -3. Let's look here. Now, again, these parentheses, what they're doing is they're making it easier to look at. And a lot of times I don't put those parentheses in there. You don't have to have those. You could write it 2 plus a -7. It just makes it look better to separate it out. And that's all those parentheses are doing. You have 7 negatives and 2 positives. 2 of these positives are going to cancel 2 of these negatives. And when you do, you're going to be left over with 5 negatives left over. So your answer is a -5. Okay, let's look at number 7. If I have 6 negatives and I have 6 positives, they're going to cancel each other out and you're going to get 0. So your answer is 0. What if I have 2 negatives and I add 3 negatives? Nothing's canceling out. There's no positives to cancel out. So when I take 2 negatives and I add 3 negatives, I get 5 negatives. Okay, together, nothing canceled out. So you end up with 5 negatives. Look at number 9. I have 11 negatives and I'm going to add 12 negatives. Nothing's going to cancel out like they have when you have positives and negatives. Some of them are going to cancel, left us with 3 of the negatives. Here, -11 plus a -12 is going to leave us with a -23 when I combine those. But let's look at this one right here. I'm not going to draw -90 negatives, but if I have 90 negatives and 43 positives, I know I've got more negatives, right? So I'm going to end up with more negatives. So your answer will be negative. But when I add these together, I'm going to end up with 47. Yes, I'm going to end up with an extra 47 negatives. I guess you can think about it like a subtraction. You just take 90 minus 43 to find out what's the difference there. And I end up with 47 extra negatives. Okay. Let's see what's on the back side. Some more practice. Let's do that. 0 plus a -99. If you have nothing and you add 99 negatives, you're going to have 99 negatives. If you have 38 negatives and 38 positives, they're going to cancel each other out, and you're going to end up with 0. Okay, here I have 31 positives and negative, and I have 11 negatives. These are going to cancel out 11 of those. So what's left? You can always subtract them to see what would be left. 31 minus 11. I'm going to end up with 20 positives left over. Okay, positive ones left over. Here, -77 negatives, and I'm going to add 10 more negatives. Nothing will cancel out. I'll end up with a -87. I'll have 87 negatives when I add those together. Well, let's skip down and let's look at these right here. what happens if I'm adding, and I've got a bunch of things here. Well, the best thing to do is, hopefully my dogs aren't going to start barking too much, but oh well. I was looking for another sheet of paper, but here, what I suggest you do is combine all the negatives and combine all the positives. Well, here we have 2 of the negatives. So I've got 32 negatives and 22 negatives for a total of 54 negatives plus 17 positives. Well, 17 of these positives are going to cancel some of these negatives, 17 of these right here. So to find out what's left, you can subtract these two. You can take the 54 minus 17. You're going to have 37 negatives left. Okay. Here, you'll have 37 negatives left. If you want to find out how much is left, you can subtract them. Let's look at 18. I've got these positives, so I'm going to go ahead and add the positives. So that gives me 56 positives. If I have 47 positives and add 9 positives, plus I have 15 negatives. 15 of these negatives are going to cancel 15 of these. So what's left? Well, let's go ahead and subtract the 15 out. You get 1. You're going to have 41 left of this, and they're going to all be positives. So your answer is 41. Okay. All right. So, and then like on number 19, they're all negatives. And so you would just add them all together and you would come up with how many negatives you've got. On number 20, you've got these negatives, add them all together. And then you've got these positives and add those two together and then see what you've got left. And it looks to me that you'll have 60, 86, probably more negatives than you will positives, but it might be kind of close. All right. But that's the idea, is go ahead and combine the positives, combine the negatives, and then see how many you've got of whatever's larger. Like here we had more positives than we did negatives. How many more? We had 41. Okay. All right. Well, that pretty much covers those 2 sections. And I'm going to try to get the next section done. All right. Let me know if you've got any questions. Thanks.